You know that moment when you look at someone and think you know that person, but actually have no idea who they really are. Well, that's exactly what happened with my son-in-law Marcus on the most embarrassing night of his life. And I confess, I felt immense satisfaction watching every second of that epic twist he never imagined could happen. Because sometimes life has a very peculiar way of putting people in their place, especially those who think they can step on others without any consequences. And this story I'm going to tell you today is so surreal, so full of twists, that you won't believe it when I get to the part where everything completely transforms. My name is Grace Thompson. I'm 63 years old. I'm Black, mother of the wonderful Jasmine. And for a long time, I was seen only as a simple woman who worked her entire life cleaning other people's houses. And I admit there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, because I've always been very proud of my honest work. I always put food on my daughter's table, always paid our bills on time, always kept our dignity intact. Even when money was so tight, we had to choose between paying the electricity or buying extra groceries. But what people didn't know, what my son-in-law Marcus especially had no idea about, was that behind this facade of simplicity, there existed a much more complex and fascinating story than anyone could imagine. It all started 3 months ago, when my daughter Jasmine announced she was engaged to Marcus, a man who worked at a tech company, always dressed in those expensive suits, always talking about investments and business opportunities, always with that air of superiority that deeply bothered me from the first moment I met him. But I bit my tongue, because my Jasmine was radiant, her eyes sparkled when she talked about him. And as a mother, you learn that sometimes you need to let your children make their own mistakes, discover on their own the character of people, even when every fiber of your being is screaming for you to intervene and protect them from an inevitable disillusionment. Marcus was 35 years old, came from an upper-middle-class family, studied at good schools, and made it very clear in every conversation that he considered himself far above all of us, especially me. And I noticed it in the sidelong glances, in the subtle but cutting comments, in the way he avoided greeting me properly when he arrived to pick up Jasmine, as if my touch could somehow contaminate him or lower him socially. And there was one occasion when he even asked my daughter if I really needed to be present at their engagement dinner because some of his friends would be there, and he didn't want it to be awkward. Imagine that. He didn't want the bride's mother to be at the engagement dinner itself, because that would be awkward for him. Jasmine, poor thing, was so involved, so blind to what she thought was love, that she tried to justify every terrible attitude of his, saying Marcus was just nervous about the wedding, that he had a lot of stress at work, that I was misinterpreting things. But a mother knows, a mother always knows when something is deeply wrong. And I knew that sooner or later that house of cards would collapse. I just didn't imagine it would be in such a spectacular way, so public, so absolutely devastating to his inflated ego. The fateful dinner was scheduled for a Friday night at an elegant Italian restaurant downtown, one of those places with white tablecloths, candles on each table, waiters who seemed to be judging you all the time, and a bill that could easily pay a month's rent. And Marcus made a point of choosing this specific place because he wanted to impress his parents, who would finally come to officially meet my daughter. And he also invited some important work colleagues, his boss, and basically turned what should be an intimate family dinner into a sort of disguised corporate networking event. When I arrived at the restaurant that night, wearing my best dress, a simple but elegant navy blue dress I bought especially for the occasion, Marcus could barely hide the expression of disapproval on his face, and I heard when he whispered something to one of his friends, something I couldn't completely understand, but that was certainly nothing kind based on the giggles that followed. And at that moment I had to take a deep breath, count to 10, and remind myself that I was there for my daughter, not for him, and that I would endure any necessary humiliation if it meant being present at an important moment in Jasmine's life. The table was large, circular, easily accommodated the 15 people who were present, and Marcus strategically placed me in the seat farthest from him, almost on the other side of the table, between two people I didn't know and who clearly had no interest in talking to me, while he was surrounded by his parents, his boss, important friends, and my Jasmine, who he kept very close as if she were a trophy to display. And during the first half hour, everything proceeded relatively smoothly, with polite conversations about work, about wedding plans, about trivialities that meant absolutely nothing. But then came the moment when Marcus decided it would be funny, that it would be a good idea to make some jokes at my expense, and he started subtly, commenting on how admirable it was that I had worked so long cleaning houses, how that demonstrated character and determination. But the way he said it, the condescending tone, the emphasis on the word cleaning, made it very clear it wasn't a sincere compliment, but rather a veiled way to diminish me in front of everyone present. And I saw some of them exchange uncomfortable looks, but no one said anything. No one confronted him. Everyone just smiled politely and continued with their conversations. Encouraged by the lack of reaction, Marcus continued, and his comments became increasingly direct, increasingly cruel, and he began telling stories about how Jasmine came from humble origins, how she had to overcome so many difficulties, how it was a testament to American social mobility that she managed to get where she was, and although the words themselves weren't necessarily offensive, the context, the way he delivered them, implied that he was doing an enormous favor by marrying her. That he was elevating her and consequently her entire family to a superior social level, as if we were his charity objects. Jasmine was getting visibly uncomfortable, her smile forced, her nervous hands playing with the napkin in her lap, and I wanted to scream, wanted to get up from the table and drag my daughter out of that terrible place. But something told me to stay quiet, to wait, because there was a strange energy in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. And then Marcus made the fatal mistake, the mistake that would change everything. He raised his wine glass, asked for everyone's attention, and began a toast that quickly turned into a monologue about his achievements, about how he built his career from scratch, about how he valued hard work and dedication. And then, looking directly at me, he said something that made my blood freeze. He said he hoped I understood that, although my work cleaning houses was honest, there were different levels of success in life, and that he hoped I wouldn't feel inferior for not having reached the same professional levels as him, because after all, not everyone is born with the same capabilities and opportunities, and some people are destined to serve while others are destined to lead. The silence that followed was deafening. You could literally hear a pin drop, and I saw the color disappearing from Jasmine's face, saw tears beginning to form in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a rage so deep, so visceral, that I had to hold my hands under the table to avoid doing something I would regret. But before I could respond, before anyone could say anything, a deep and authoritative voice cut through the awkward silence. A man who was sitting at a table behind Marcus, a table I hadn't paid much attention to until that moment, stood up and began walking toward us, and I immediately recognized who he was, and my heart leapt in my chest, because that man was Richard Montgomery, one of the most successful and respected businessmen in the city, owner of a chain of luxury hotels, known philanthropist, board member of several important organizations, and someone I knew very, very well, although no one at that table had the slightest idea of this. Richard was about 70 years old, a distinguished black man, always impeccably dressed, with that presence that commanded immediate respect. And as he approached our table, I could see the confusion on Marcus's face, who clearly recognized who that man was and was trying to understand why someone of that importance would be walking directly toward us, and Marcus's boss, who was sitting next to him, became visibly nervous, straightening his posture, trying to look more presentable. Richard stopped directly behind Marcus, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, and with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he said loud enough for the whole table to hear that he couldn't help but overhear the interesting toast that had just been made, and that he was particularly intrigued by the comments about different levels of success and about people who are destined to serve versus people destined to lead. And Marcus, completely unaware of what was happening but clearly trying to impress, began to stammer something about how they were just general observations about society, nothing personal. Richard then looked directly at me, and his face lit up with a genuine smile, warm, full of affection, And he said loud enough for everyone to hear that he would like to introduce to everyone who didn't know Dr. Grace Thompson, who besides being one of the most intelligent and hardworking women he ever had the privilege of knowing, was also the silent investor and co-founder of 3 of his most successful hotels, and the reason he was where he was today. I saw heads turn in my direction so fast it was almost comical, saw Marcus's jaw literally drop open, saw Jasmine's eyes widen in surprise, and saw Marcus's boss turn pale as a ghost. And Richard continued, explaining that I had been his business partner for over 30 years, that we invested together in various ventures, that my strategic vision and financial sense were impeccable, and that any success he had in life was partially due to my guidance and support. Marcus tried to speak, tried to say something, but no sound came out of his mouth. And Richard still wasn't finished. He continued saying that it was true. I worked cleaning houses for many years, but what people didn't know was that I did it strategically, cleaning the houses of influential people, observing how they lived, learning about their businesses, their strategies, building relationships. And that's how I met his father decades ago when I cleaned the Montgomery family house. And it was his father who saw my potential, who realized I had a sharp mind for business, and who gave me the opportunity to invest in his first properties. The truth was that for years I kept a low profile, investing discreetly, building a considerable fortune, but always living simply because I believed ostentation was vulgar and unnecessary, and because I wanted Jasmine to grow up with solid values, understanding the real value of money and honest work, not surrounded by privilege that could have made her presumptuous and disconnected from reality. And now, seeing the horrified expression on my son-in-law's face, I understood that perhaps I had hidden the truth for too long. Richard then turned to Marcus and asked if he worked at TechVision, the tech company. And Marcus, still in shock, could only nod his head. And Richard smiled that sharp smile and said how interesting, because he was one of the main investors in TechVision, a member of the board of directors, and was always very attentive to the behavior and character of the company's employees, especially those in leadership positions, and that he would be very interested in discussing with the CEO, who was a personal friend of his, about the values and culture being promoted within the organization. Marcus's boss, who until that moment had been trying to disappear inside his own suit, suddenly stood up and began apologizing profusely, saying he was sure there was a misunderstanding, that Marcus was just nervous about the wedding, that he certainly didn't mean anything offensive. But Richard raised his hand in a gesture that clearly meant silence, and said there was no misunderstanding at all, that he heard perfectly well every word that was said, and that character revealed in private. Moments is a person's true character. Marcus finally recovered the ability to speak and began apologizing, saying he didn't know, that if he had known who I really was, he would never have said those things. And that's when I finally spoke, standing up from my chair, looking directly into his eyes, and saying very slowly and clearly that that was exactly the problem, that he was only apologizing because he discovered I had money and connections, but that respect and human decency shouldn't depend on someone's bank account or social status, and that if he couldn't treat with dignity a woman he thought was just a simple domestic worker, then he didn't deserve to be in her family. Jasmine was openly crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of anger mixed with a kind of relief, as if finally a blindfold had fallen from her eyes, and she stood up, took the engagement ring off her finger, placed it on the table in front of Marcus, and said the engagement was cancelled, that she couldn't marry someone who treated her mother or anyone else with so much contempt and disrespect, and that she only regretted not having realized earlier the kind of man he really was. Marcus's parents tried to intervene, saying we were all being very dramatic, that it was just a misunderstanding, but Jasmine cut them off, saying there was no drama at all, just clarity, and that she was grateful this revelation happened before the wedding and not after. And then she took my hand, and we began to leave the restaurant together, with Richard accompanying us, leaving Marcus and his guests in an absolutely deadly silence. In the car, on the way home, Jasmine finally asked me why I had never told her about the investments, about the partnership with Richard, about the full extent of our financial situation, and I explained that I wanted her to grow up normal, to develop her own identity and achievements without the pressure or expectations that come with money, that I wanted her to be loved and valued for who she was and not for what she possessed, but that perhaps I had exaggerated the secrecy and that it was time to be more open about these things. She hugged me tight and said she understood, that she appreciated the intention even if she disagreed a bit with the methods, and that she was relieved to have escaped a marriage that would have been a terrible mistake, and confessed she had been having doubts for weeks but was afraid to admit it, afraid to disappoint me or seem indecisive, but that night was confirmation that her instinct was right. In the following days, the story spread like wildfire on social media in that small business community. Some of the guests at that dinner apparently couldn't keep their mouths shut, and Marcus became a laughingstock in several circles, known as the man who tried to humiliate the millionaire mother-in-law. And I learned from Richard that there was a serious meeting at TechVision about the incident. And although Marcus wasn't fired, he was removed from his leadership position and placed in a much less prestigious role, and that his boss made it very clear that behavior of that kind would not be tolerated in the company. As for Jasmine, she took a few weeks to process everything, to deal with the end of the relationship and with the revelations about the family's financial situation. But she emerged from this experience stronger, more confident, more aware of the kind of partner she deserved. And a few months later, she started dating someone new, a history teacher at a public school, a kind and humble man who treated her like a queen and who treated me with genuine respect regardless of anything I possessed or not. Richard and I continued our business partnership, and he suggested that perhaps it was time for me to take a more public role in the ventures, to come out of the shadows and receive the credit I deserved. And although the idea made me a bit uncomfortable after so many years of privacy, I began to seriously consider it, especially after Jasmine said it would be inspiring for other Black women to see someone like me in positions of power and influence. I also decided to use part of my fortune to create a scholarship program for young people from underprivileged communities who wanted to pursue careers in business and entrepreneurship, something I should have done years ago, and I named the program in honor of my mother, who worked until the last day of her life and never had the opportunity to see how much her daughter managed to build. As for Marcus, I learned he tried to contact Jasmine several times, sending apology messages, flowers, even a long letter explaining how he was working on himself and recognizing his mistakes. But she was firm in keeping her distance, and I completely supported that decision, because forgiveness is one thing, but reconciliation is completely another, and some bridges once burned simply cannot and should not be rebuilt. The most important lesson I took from this whole experience is that you should never judge anyone by their appearance or occupation, because you never really know who is in front of you, what battles they fought, what achievements they reached, and more importantly, you should treat all people with basic respect and dignity, not because they deserve it based on social status or bank account, but simply because they are human beings, and that should be reason enough. Looking back now, months after that fateful dinner, I almost feel gratitude that Marcus revealed his true nature in such a public and undeniable way, because if he had kept the mask on longer, if he had waited until after the wedding to show who he really was, the damage would have been much greater, and Jasmine's suffering would have been unnecessarily prolonged. So, in a very strange sense, his arrogance and lack of self-control ended up being a blessing in disguise. And I would like to leave a message for all of you who are watching this now. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been treated as less important because your job wasn't glamorous, or because you didn't come from a wealthy family, or because your skin wasn't the right color, know that those people who judge and diminish others based on superficialities are exactly the type of people whose opinion matters absolutely nothing. Your value is not determined by others' perception, but rather by the character you demonstrate, by the way you treat people, especially those who can do nothing for you, and by the legacy you build through your actions and choices. Keep working hard, keep being honest and upright, keep treating everyone with respect, regardless of who they are or what they possess, because at the end of the day, when you look in the mirror, the only approval that really matters is your own, And if you can sleep at night with a clear conscience, knowing you did your best and treated people with dignity, then you are already more successful than any Marcus in this world could dream of being. And always remember that appearances deceive, that person you're about to underestimate might be exactly someone who will determine your future. So treat everyone as if they were the most important person in the world, because to themselves, they are. My daughter Jasmine is now happier than ever, found someone who genuinely values her, is planning a simple and intimate wedding with only the people who really matter. And she told me the other day that she's grateful every day for having escaped that toxic relationship before it was too late. And I, as a mother, couldn't be prouder of the strong and determined woman she has become. Someone who is not willing to accept less than she deserves. Someone who understands that material wealth means nothing if you don't have wealth of character. And that's the true lesson I hope all of you take from this story. So here's my challenge for you today. I want you to leave a comment telling about some time when you were underestimated, or when you underestimated someone and later discovered something surprising. Because these stories need to be shared, need to be heard, and serve as powerful reminders that we should never judge a book by its cover. And while you're here, don't forget to click the subscribe button, because I have many more stories to share with you. Stories about life lessons, about unexpected twists, about how life has its peculiar way of putting people in their place. And leave that like, if you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, because each like, each comment, each subscription shows me that these messages are reaching the right people and making the difference I hope they make in the world. And for those of you who are going through difficult situations now, who are being belittled or disrespected, I want you to know that time is the greatest revealer of truths, that eventually masks fall and true character is exposed. So keep your head up, keep doing the work, keep being people of integrity, because in the end, the truth always comes out and justice somehow prevails. Maybe not in the way we expect or in the time we'd like, but it comes. And when it does, make sure you're on the right side of history, on the side of those who treated others with respect and dignity, regardless of circumstances. This story is a testament that you should never allow other people to define your value, that you should never bow to those who try to diminish you, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't to retaliate, but simply to live well and let the truth speak for itself. Because when you live with integrity, when you build something real and substantial through honest work and ethical decisions, you create a foundation that no one can tear down, no matter how hard they try. And that's a lesson I hope Marcus has finally learned, although it cost him a relationship, a reputation, and a promising career. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, with someone who is being belittled, with someone who forgot their own value, because messages like these have the power to change perspectives, to give strength when people need it most, to remind all of us that we are not alone in our struggles and that there is justice in this world, even if sometimes it takes time to appear. And keep following this channel, because I have a mission to share stories that inspire, that educate, that make people think twice before judging others, and that ultimately make this world a little bit better and more compassionate. Until the next story, always remember to treat people with kindness, to never underestimate anyone based on appearances, and to build your lives on foundations of integrity and mutual respect, because these are the things that really matter at the end of the day. And don't forget to leave that comment, that like, and that subscription, because each of you is part of this community we're building together. A community based on real values and true stories that need to be told.